Okay, so thank you so much to the conference organizers and to you, David, for putting together this wonderful panel. I absolutely loved your presentations. So as you can see here on my presentation, my talk today is entitled The Haunted West of Clayre Vaye Watkins. And today I would just like to introduce you to this author if you don't know her. The truth is that she doesn't really write weird Western specifically, but her work certainly grapples with the weirdness of the contemporary West. So, as I was saying, if you don't know her, Clayre Vaye Watkins is a 40-year-old California-born, Nevada-based author. She's also an academic, and she currently teaches creative writing. She lives in the Mojave Desert, where she used to live when she was a child, and her literary production focuses on life in the contemporary West and deals with the aftermaths of Western history, which has been traditionally characterized by violence. Violence, too, is part of Watkins's own personal history, and I don't typically like to resort to authors' biographies as a background for my analysis, but in her case, and especially given the autofictional slant of her writing, it seems imperative to do so. Watkins is the daughter of Paul Watkins, who was a member of the Manson family and who collaborated with murderer Charles Manson in the 1960s in California. And so, in this way, in the recent history of California and the West at large, become imbricated in our author's own personal and family histories, with violence, as I say, being one of the defining elements of such histories. This is relevant because Watkins herself recognizes that these are the materials of her life and subsequently of her writing. And as I say, Watkins herself, dwelling on her father's legacy specifically, has stated the following, and I read here. My father first came to Death Valley because Charles Manson told him to. This is what he gave me. This place, the desert of Highway 127 on the southernmost edge of Death Valley. It is the only thing that satiates my hunger for him. We look like tourists here, but we are the very opposite. This is the only place we've ever known. My sister and I are barefoot, she in his arms, me in the dirt. The ground here is strewn with hazards. Stickers and goat heads, mesquite thorns, scorpions, rattlesnakes. You can almost see them. What it would have been to walk here alongside him in the place where the family gave way to our family. As you can see here, I have highlighted in bold all of the elements that kind of connote violence in Watkins's description of the desert lands that she would call home. We have rattlesnakes, thorns, and above all, the family, right? That is the Manson family. So here it's very evident how Watkins establishes a link between the Manson family, as they were known, and her own family of four, suggesting that her very existence was born out of a history of violence. And it is precisely this centrality of violence that in Watkins's work that I will be focusing on today. So to this day, Watkins has published 3 books that arguably deal with different representations of violence in the West. The first one that you have here is Battleborn, and it's a collection of short stories that came out in 2012. And in it, we can find a wide array of representations of violence that range from the history of environmental exploitation of the Western landscape, as we will see in a minute, to the touristification of the Bush West, to multifarious representations of sexual violence, like the one we find in Men of War, one of the stories that tells the story of a pregnant teenage girl who has ostensibly been raped by her father. Then we have her debut novel, Gold Fame Citrus, published in 2015. And this would be the one that fits the category of the weird Western most of the 3, because it's a dystopian speculative fiction novel that presents a near future apocalyptic California where drought makes life almost impossible for its inhabitants. And critics have described the novel as chronicling the death of the California dream. And lastly, we have her second novel, her third book, I Love You But I've Chosen Darkness, published 3 years ago in 2021, which combines the unsalvageable West, as an LA Times critic has called it, with the topic of motherhood, which was also present in her previous work. And Watkins herself has claimed that this is a novel version of Ghosts Cowboys, which is the first story that we can find in Battleborn. So as you see, violence has a front and center presence in Watkins's literary production. But you may be thinking that the notion of violence has always been a cornerstone of representations of the US West since early settler colonial times. Critic Richard Slotkin proposed already in the 1970s, from a new Western history approach, that violence in frontier narratives has been used symbolically to uphold westward expansion and ultimately national identity. His famous thesis of regeneration through violence proposed that a redemptive notion of violence has been mobilized in frontier narratives to legitimize settler dominance and to justify the subjugation of subaltern groups. The implications of Slotkin's monumental study, which serves as a new Western counterpoint to the uplifting version of the frontier that emanates from Turner's frontier thesis that David was talking about, have been further explored by other post-Western critics who keep revising it to this day. So one could argue that Watkins's work both refashions and deconstructs Slotkin's thesis if you consider that violence is still in her text a defining element of the West. But the representation of violence in Watkins does not bring about regeneration, as in the original formulation, but rather the opposite. Watkins' depiction of violence is not uplifting or redeeming, but rather questioning, critical, and interrogating. And in fact, she has claimed in an interview that, and I quote, interrogating the myth of the American West is the only political cause that I'm interested in. This results in a representation of the US West as a region that is weighed down by its own past, struggling with a heritage of land theft, genocide, and post-tourist expansion. This is what explains her own vision of the West as haunted, and I quote her here again. She says, "The West for me is a haunted place. There are these mythic ghosts everywhere you go. I don't know of a region that buys its own bullshit more so than the American West does." And this Watkins, is incorporated into the post-Western tradition of literary studies, in which, according to William Hanley, and I quote, there are no American Adams from the classic mold here. Neither are there particular Turnerian individuals, even in Turner's historiography. Instead, there are complicated, often very unromantic, and at times exceedingly violent relationships that carry the burden of the Western past, rendered for us through the distortions of retrospection and the perspective of lonely narrators. So this is what allows me to posit that indeed this haunted and violent West is the defining element of Watkins's literary project. And to exemplify this claim, I will now move on to discuss three texts from her first book, Battleborn, where I look at the different representational strategies employed in the volume. So the first one is Ghost Cowboys, which, as I anticipated, is the first story, the opening story of the volume. And here we find a first-person narrator who identifies herself as a Nevadan and then as Clayre. So you can see already this autofunctional slant. In terms of the plot, the narrative voice starts off by making a one-line comment about her present situation. She says, "The day my mom checked out, so the day my mom died, razor blade baby moved in. And then," she says, "I can't stop thinking about beginnings." What follows then are several attempts that the narrator makes to locate a point of origin that explains her current situation, which we as readers still know nothing about. These attempts to locate a point of origin are structured around different historical moments of the state of Nevada, where she comes from. And they start with the founding of Reno, and then they keep coming a bit closer to the present each of the times. And so the narration in this way creates a genealogy of sorts where contemporary life in the West, and Nevada in particular, is directly impacted by its past. The narrator's first attempt to locate the point of origin of her life harks back to the founding of Reno, as I just said, which took place along the discovery of the Comstock lode in 1859, and which was entirely dependent on the gold and silver findings in Nevada in the 19th century, which obviously boosted this economy based on immediate prosperity and equally immediate decline. This discovery entailed the emergence of what the narrator calls the curse. She says, "The curse, excavated from the silver vein and weighted by the heavy ore, settled on the nation's newest free state." So the fate of Nevada, the newest free state, and the nation is tied to the curse that stems from mineral extraction during the silver rush. So this curse, physically extracted from the mountain, from the silver vein, represents this weight of that transhistorical violence and geographical violence that Battleborn attests to. Then this curse is perpetuated in the story by the Nevada test site, the grounds where the U.S. government did nuclear testing. And so this contaminating dust that emerged from the Comstock load is now reproduced in the radioactive dust of the nuclear tests in the 19th century. Sorry, in the 20th century. So this landscape that was created, or rather destroyed, in the 20th century is but one iteration of the curse that started with the founding of the state a century earlier. And in the story, the Nevada test site relates to the narrator's mom's affective landscape because when she was a child, she used to live in Las Vegas, she tells us, and she would hear the explosions of the site, and she eventually became a downwinder affected by those radioactive dusts. The story later informs us that this cursed dust that emerged from the Comstock lode and that was perpetuated by the Nevada test site, where it settled on the narrator's mom's lungs, finally travels to the Spawn Ranch, where the Manson family used to live in real life. If you have seen Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you may remember this. So as we can see, the narrator is kind of narrowing down the history of the state from the most general to the most personal, her mom's lungs. And in doing so, she's putting together all the layers of Western history and geography and creating a single solid history of violence. So we can see how the opening story serves to establish, as Seth Horton states, and I quote, the major themes of the book, which are violence, history's haunting influences of the present, and the 21st century need to revise the mythology of the US West. Now, moving on to the second story that I'm going to discuss. This is the second story of the volume, and it's entitled The Last Thing We Need. And in it, we can find the story of Thomas Gray, a man who likes to drive up to the desert, and particularly to Rhyolite, which is a ghost town in Nevada. In one of these excursions, he finds a lot of debris and personal belongings scattered around the land, and they apparently belong to a man called Dwayne. And so the story that we read is entirely made up exclusively of the letters that Thomas decides to write to Dwayne. So we thus witness the monologue of a lonely man, probably traumatized by some past events. We actually learned that he had to kill a man in self-defense. And remember Hanley's quote that I read a while ago about how the contemporary West is inhabited by lonely individuals in unromantic quests. So approaching this story, my questions are, what sort of violence does this story represent? And what do the representational means, in this case, the epistolary genre, signify? So with regards to violence, violence in this story is connoted by the setting, by Rhyolite. I just told you it's a ghost town and it's located between Death Valley and the Nevada test site. And so it is in itself a place of inherent violence that emblematizes the destructive settlement of the West. The town came to life in 1905 as a result of the Nevada gold rush and was abandoned by 1911. So just 6 years of a lifespan of 6 years. As a ghost town, it confronts the dominant narrative of Western prosperity in direct ways by offering an example of a failed town that debunks what Patricia Limerick calls the teleological model of westward expansion. So choosing to set one of her stories in Rhyolite shows how Watkins is focusing on what Limerick again calls Western contraction as opposed to Western expansion and progress. Limerick and Clayre, in an article eloquently titled Haunted by Rhyolite, Learning from the Landscape of Failure, where they examine the cultural significance of Rhyolite, state that, and I quote, the American West has long been home to a cult of ruins. Shelves of books testify to the fact that the passion for the relics of dead towns had its center of gravity in the West. There are, of course, failed towns everywhere, but the West has made abandoned town sites into part of its capital. So it's ruins and not progress that have become the heritage of Western history. And this ghost town full of ruins is emblematic of the history of the West, and it kind of talks about the emptiness of emptiness as an overarching motive of this violence that has been inflicted by Western history and Western culture. So what about the letters then? Why this epistolary genre for the story? Well, this motive of emptiness is what gives me the key. What I just said allows me to understand the epistolary structure of the story as a textual means of representing emptiness and ultimately violence. Thomas Gray writes letters to a man that, for all we know, could be dead, that he knows nothing about, and even tells him about his most, his innermost life events and feelings. So this emptiness that he finds in Rhyolite kind of permeates his writings, which are directed at an absence, a ghost, a void. Emptiness then is confronted literally and metaphorically by our epistolary narrator, who at one point in the story even claims that a child means nothing here, somehow suggesting that this outsized, fast, arid landscape erases meaning, and what is most sacred in society loses its meanings out here in this landscape of ruins. So the story serves to stage the confrontation that William Hanley describes when he discusses how, quote, American technological and individualistic triumph confronts the ghost town, finding no one at home. And lastly, I will talk about Rondine El Nido, another of the volume stories. In this story, we find an adult woman telling her lover an episode of her adolescence. Her story recounts how she, as a teenager, went to Las Vegas in the wake of 9/11 with a friend, and both of them ended up being gang raped in a hotel room by a bunch of boys. So the structure of the story is a frame narrative, a story within a story, in which we get the outer narrative, the adult protagonist telling the story, and then the inner frame where we get the story of her adolescence. Neither the time nor the place in the story are coincidental. The fact that the narrative takes place right before 9/11 indicates that there is a deliberate wish to intertwine personal violence with national violence. Indeed, the narrator will also tell us how later in life she was involved with a man that abused her, that hit her in public, and she tells us that the first time he hit her was on the 4th of July. So once again, this is reinforcing the connection between national and individual violence, which in this story seems sort of inextricable. Then we have the setting, Las Vegas. Las Vegas as a setting also connotes violence, as this city has been stereotypically, traditionally taken as a symbol for, excess, lust, banality, and indeed violence. We can read about how the narration explains that, and I quote, there are college boys from places like Chicago and Florida and New York City wandering the strip, 60 miles away. Boys who came to Las Vegas looking for girls willing to do the things she and Lena think they are willing to do. So, setting a story of sexual violence in the West at large, beyond the symbolic connotations of Las Vegas, is also telling insofar as the West has long been represented as a repository for masculinist violence. As Neil Campbell explains, quote, the conquest of the West was often expressed in masculinist images of sexual violence, exploring the psychosexual dynamic, where the land as feminine provided a repetitive image of the West as a place of male protection, possession, and assault, in which the woman was passively held as fantasy or ideal. So the stories in Battleborn seem to be heir to this premise, and Rondine El Nido specifically highlights how setting and temporality help to further insist on the idea of the West as a fundamentally violent place. And as Laura de la Parra has explained, the frame narrative in the story, so the structural elements, are used to shed light on, and I quote, the girl's lack of awareness about what the men are about to do and actually do. The frame narrative then provides a space to break away from the silence, from the incomprehension. In this way, the text creates, following De la Parra, a space where the adult protagonist can come to terms with the sexual abuse that she was subjected to in her past, and to reassess the sexual violence that she could not understand when she was a teenager, but which she does now as an adult. In sum, Rondine El Nido plays with the meanings generated by time, place, and narrative structure to produce a story that centers the sexual violence of the West, read not through an individual lens, but through a national one. So to conclude, as you can see, these three stories incorporate different representational strategies to portray the contemporary West. Whether it is through autofiction and a teleological quest to search for the beginnings of the West, or through the epistolary genre and its possibilities to highlight the absence of an interlocutor, or to the frame narrative of the last text, Battlebond emerges as an incredibly rich volume that contains different mechanisms to convey a simple idea that the West is a place of violence. I hope to have shown how the multifarious strategies of representation that we can find in Battleborn allow us readers to explore the narrative, symbolic, and ideological implications of clinging to violence as a structuring principle of the contemporary West. In permanent dialogue with the mythic West, Watkins's West appears as both haunted and haunting, burdened by the debilitating influences of a mythic past. Thanks so much. That's all for me.
Thank you so much, Sophia, for this insightful presentation about one of the best writers of the New West. In fact, some of the students here know one of the stories, Ghost Cowboys. Uh, I think we don't have time for questions. Maybe we may have just one question or one comment because we have a coffee break now. But you have any questions or comments? Yeah, sí, por favor.